So, Lone Rider here, and this may come as no surprise to anybody who reads the King's English, but with a name like Lone Rider, yes, I'm into cycling. But in particular, I'm into older stuff. Don't get me wrong, I have at least one or two modern aluminum road bikes floating around with carbon forks, but truth be told, I really like old school stuff. And the reason for that, I think, is in part that when I started riding, old school wasn't old school. It was just the way things were. And that's never more so than some of the vintage or old school mountain bike stuff. Such as, for example, this, I think it's a 1994 or 1995 GT Karakoram. This was a decent mid-range mountain bike at its time. Not really high-end, but, not low-end either. Came with air shocks, full complement of gears, front and rear, and, all that jazz. But as you can see, it's been stripped down to a frame only. I'm going to be working on this, and I'm going to be cleaning it up, putting it all back together, and this will be a neat little project. This was, when I got it, it was a complete bike. Excuse me. But I found the need to use some of the parts for other things. The wheels went on another bike, the fork went on another bike, and various parts got parted out here and there. The main reason for that was that I actually couldn't find a fork to fit the bike. The steer was already cut on the stock fork. It was too low without using a really angled handlebar, and so I was left to try and figure out what to do as far as that went. And I just couldn't get it to fit the way I wanted it to fit. Part of that is this frame is at the limit of my height range. It looks like a fairly short frame here. If you look at the head tube angle, this does not look, and the spacing, especially of the head tube, this does not look like a tall frame. But because this is from an era when most bikes didn't have sloping top tubes, the frame is more or less horizontal, which means you don't get a lot of extra standover clearance back here. What does this mean? Well, I couldn't use a long travel modern fork on it. That would jack the bike up, alter the head tube angle, which would not only mess with the steering, but make the bike even taller, further reducing standover height. The idea was to build this up in such a way that I could effectively ride it off-road, which is what it's designed for. Now, a lot of people with vintage mountain bikes nowadays, they just use them for cruising around. I ride almost all of mine off-road. The exception is some of the fully rigid ones, like my my vintage Cannondale, the blue one. I sometimes take that on like dirt roads and smooth, hard-packed single track. But most of the time, it's for gravel roads and around town riding. It's a great sort of do-everything bike, but it's not built up for hardcore off-roading because it's a 1-inch threaded steer and a rigid fork. And I'm getting a little old and chunky to be doing off-roading without at least some kind of front suspension. But that said, I mean, a lot of the bikes I ride off-road are, older bikes, for lack of a better word. I mean, my Airborne single speed, my Specialized single speed, even my Kona Dog, which is a dual suspension bike, is from maybe 8 years ago. It's pretty old. The bike here, of course, is from the mid-90s, and that's, pains me to say it, but that was a long time ago. Right? But I really like stuff from that era, and there was a lot of stuff that back then, being 16 or 17, I could not afford. And the funny thing is, if you wait long enough, all the stuff that was really cool when you were younger is now just old junk and can be had for really cheap. Of course, that's just it. It's not really old junk. And if you fix it up and you get it going and you know what you're doing and you know how to handle it, it can ride really nice. It can ride really nice. It's actually kind of funny. I was talking to a friend of mine after we went off-roading at what's the other one? 6 Mile Run. And we were both on single speeds. And came up in conversation, something to the effect of, you know, a lot of the people nowadays, yeah, they're really good riders and yeah, they're in really good shape, but they've never had to make do with, you know, only 7 gears in the back. They've never had to make do with narrow tires on 26-inch rims, or with 80 millimeters of travel front shock and that's it, or even rigid bikes. When I started riding, the bikes were all rigid except for the high end ones. My first mountain bike was a Trek 830. It didn't have a suspension fork until I tweaked the original fork, doing something incredibly foolish, and I ended up having an aftermarket RockShox installed. I mean, those were the days when if you wanted a shock, you had to put it on yourself, unless you bought a really high end bike. So and that's the era this was from. This was from the time when your entry level bike didn't have a shock at all, and some of your mid range bikes didn't have shocks. This particular one did, but it's in some ways. Having more basic technology made you a better rider back then. You know, you were, hair was big and gears were small, as we say about the 80s and 90s. But yeah, I mean, now you've got 11 speed, you've got all kinds of stuff, and it's wonderful in some ways. Of course, the downside is you lose a lot of compatibility with parts, and you know, one of the things that people forget is being a biker or cyclist, more properly speaking, back then wasn't just about riding. A lot of it was about working on your own stuff, tweaking it to get it just perfect, and then riding it. And there was a certain satisfaction to, you know, I didn't go out and buy the perfect bike from a shop ready assembled. I got my hands on a bike I could afford, and then I slowly upgraded it and tweaked it and got everything set up just right for me and for what I wanted with it. And so when I rode that bike, when I got to the top of a climb or managed to jump that obstacle that I wasn't able to get over before or whatever, it was like, it wasn't just that I went out and I bought the nicest bike I could afford and my only skill was having deep pockets. It was that I had a combination of the ability to ride the bike, but also the know-how and the experience from riding over the years to get it set up to where I wanted it, to do what I needed to make it do. And yeah, a lot of the stuff, I look back at a lot of the repairs I did and the way I improvised, you know, not having all the right tools, and I shudder because, you know, nowadays, I mean, I've got enough tools that I actually used to keep a spoke wrench on my keychain as a keychain, because I had extras, you know. But the point is that back then, you know, we made do with what we had, but we also learned a lot from working on our own stuff, and it was a thing of pride to be like, "Whoa, that's a nice bike, man. Yeah, I tweaked it myself," as opposed to, "Hey, that's a nice bike, man. Yeah, MasterCard bought it for me." You know, there's a difference, right? And it is kind of funny because growing up with cycling like that, it gave you an appreciation for the older stuff. And I would rather ride, you know, a vintage bike with nice parts. Yeah, there's a lot to be said for some newer stuff. Don't get me wrong, but even the newer stuff, I have a tendency to tweak it. You know, my 29er's got 650B wheels, and all of the parts except for the headset are completely non-original. You know, it's just, I could have just bought the 29er and rested on my laurels, but I was like, how do I make this better? And part of it was I needed money, so when I stripped it down, the first thing to go were the wheels. I sold those. But I could have just got another pair of 29er wheels and put it back together as is. Instead, I said to myself, I'm going to tweak this sucker. And I did, and I got it where I like it. So even there, the modern stuff doesn't stay stock for long. And part of what I think we've lost with the advantage of some of the newer stuff is the ability to take things apart, put them back together the way you want them, and have a better machine. And having a better machine isn't just about having the coolest bike on the block. The equipment, the machine, the bike, the gears, it's all about the experience, right? You can have a really cool bike. If all it does is sit on the wall, hang on the wall, it's not doing anything, okay? That really cool bike isn't supposed to hang on a wall. It's supposed to hang on a curve of single track, or in the case of a road bike, on a curve of asphalt. And whether it was road bikes or mountain bikes, and admittedly, when I got started, I got started with mountain biking. And then I became a roadie, and then I eventually went back to doing both. But And somewhere in there, I spent an indeterminable number of years riding on a single speed, which I still have, a fixed gear rather. In fact, when I was commuting by bike for over a year, most of the time was on a fixed gear. That was fun. I miss those days. But the thing, when you have everything so specialized and so narrowed down technically, it may work better together as a system, but you lose the ability to customize and tinker and make everything just the way you want it, at least easily. You can still do it, as evidenced the fact that I have with the newer bike. But there are limitations to stuff that's designed only to work together with what it's designed to work with. And the limitations are for the end user, the customer, the rider, right? Because what this is about ultimately isn't the cool stuff or the equipment or the bikes. It's about the ride, right? And people like to bitch about over commercialization. And I don't think that anybody has more to complain about in that department maybe than sports like cycling, where you need the gear to do it. You can't ride a bike without a bike, right? But at the same time, I honestly don't think that's what it is. I could care less about the commercialization, and the truth is that you want over commercialization. Look at what was going on in the 1990s, back in the old days, right? You don't have far to look. I actually have a lot of the old mountain bike magazines still around. Actually, here's one right here. This is from, well, this can't be that old because it's got mountainbike.com on it. So I mean, it's got a web address. It can't be that old. But well, I don't know. They're doing a review of a Marzocchi shock. So actually, this is pretty old. June '99. Holy cow! Wow. All right. So yeah, this is a lot older than I thought. But yeah, there's if you look through one of these old mountain bike magazines, most of it is about gear reviews and new stuff. Oh my God, a Trek VRX, right? I mean, it's all about selling you stuff. Sadly, now I keep these mostly more for nostalgia than anything else. Sometimes friends do call me up. Hey, I found this really cool vintage bike. What's it? What do you think it's worth? And I'll look through either one of these old mountain bike magazines, if I can find one from the right year, or I have some of the old catalogs lying around. I even have some of the dealer catalogs up there, and I'll be able to say, well, hey, this was the original list price. Now, ironically, there's websites for that now. You can go to various websites, and they'll give you a rundown of what the initial sale price was on a bike, and on what the the value is, or the range of value depending on condition at the current time. But I have all of these lying around. I have a stack about yay tall. I don't need the damn website for that. And a lot of it's just intuitive. You remember, But yeah, the old mountain bike magazines were all about selling you crap. In fact, they got a whole section that was nothing but ads, right? Nothing but ads for parts with prices in big black and white numbers and letters. So the idea that commercialization is a problem with cycling, no, it's always been commercialized. Look at these ads, right? What then is the issue? I think it's not so much commercialization, it's that people are missing out on an aspect of it. They're still getting the ride. They're still going out there and riding their bikes and getting the experience of riding their bikes. But they're missing out on the aspect that, to us, was always part of that ride, which was the setup. Tweaking the bike, getting everything just perfect. It was a combination of being a rider and a mechanic and a tinkerer and an inventor, right? It was, you'd be out there in your garage working on something, trying to get it just right. And when you got it and it clicked, and man, that shifter worked just perfect, or those cantilever brakes were finally set up just right, you felt like your own little Thomas Edison in his laboratory, man. Like you made some kind of a breakthrough. Just like you felt like you made some kind of a breakthrough when you could finally get to the top of that hill before everybody else, or at least without being too far behind everyone else. And that's something that I think we are losing as a newer generation. I think we're we're losing an appreciation for the hands-on. You know, anybody can, well, anybody who has money in their bank account can go into a store and just buy the nicest bike in the store. It doesn't mean you're going to be a good rider. Having the nicest bike that's lighter and has more gears and yada yada is going to give you an obvious technical advantage. But it doesn't mean you're any better a rider than you were before. And it doesn't necessarily mean you've learned anything about the bike and how it works, which I honestly believe make you a better rider. Whereas if you're working on your own stuff, even if you're not an expert mechanic, even if you're just an inveterate tinkerer, if you're working on your own stuff, I honestly believe having more of an understanding of how the stuff works, which is necessary to learn how to set it up properly, makes you a better rider because you understand how your tools and equipment work. You know, it's not necessary to understand how it works to simply ride the bike, but I honestly think to get the most out of the experience, to appreciate it, it helps to know how everything works, to have a personal hand in setting that bike up just right, and then to go out and ride it. And that's when everything comes together and coalesces. And you have those days where you're sitting there and at the end of the day, you're just thinking about everything you did and you're looking at the sun go down and you're saying to yourself, today was a good day. I can't wait to do it again. And ultimately, that's what it was always about. It was never really about gear or equipment or, you know, hanging the fanciest titanium parts off your bike. It was about that experience, that moment when you were like, man, this is awesome. And I honestly do believe, though, that a necessary ingredient, for me anyway, in my experience, to get to that moment was not only learning about the bike and how everything worked together and tinkering with it and getting everything just right, and then going out and riding it and then seeing all that effort pay off in being able to maybe do a little more, or do something you couldn't do before, and, you know, have a good time. And that, but it was, you weren't just a consumer. You weren't just somebody buying a bike off the shelf. You bought the raw materials in terms of the bike off your shelf, and then you decided what you wanted to put on it, how you wanted to tweak it. Maybe you got secondhand parts. You know, it was a big thing when I was, you know, starting out. You look around and you see what other people are using, and if somebody was getting rid of some cool stuff because it was, for them it was old, maybe for you it was new, and you're like, hey, you know, can I? And you'd get that, you know, all you got in there is Shimano Altus, and somebody is throwing away, you know, a brand new XT derailleur. Yeah, maybe you need to replace one of the pulleys or something because it's worn, but it's an XT derailleur, man, right? You know, so you get used parts, or you know, I remember it was the greatest thing in the world was to go out on cleanup week, and if you found a wrecked bike by the curb, take it home and pull all the parts off, because there was always one or two pieces of mid-range or high-end parts that were better than what you had on your own. And just because maybe the frame was wrecked or something, or the wheel was messed up, didn't mean that there weren't usable parts on that bike. And yet it's led to some problems, like, you know, not realizing that certain bottom bracket spindle lengths didn't work with certain cranks. And then, well, how come my cranks are hitting my frame, you know? But that's part of the learning process. You know, you learn by doing. Nowadays, it seems like people just learn by buying stuff. Oh, nice bike. Where'd you get it? Well, I bought it years ago. I rode it until I realized what needed to be improved. I painstakingly tinkered with it over the years, and now, after 5 years, it's just right and it's just where I want it. Versus, hey man, nice bike. Where'd you get it? Oh, Amazon.com. Yeah. Both people are cyclists, but who do you think is really enjoying the ride? Anyway, just a little bit about older bikes and why I like them, and some of my, if you want to call it philosophy on the subject. Your mileage may vary, you know. That's the great thing about, you know, cycling, is that, you know, pretty much you can do whatever you want to your bike. So if you want to leave it completely stock, as the guy from Amazon.com delivered it to your door, go right ahead. But there are those of us who remember when part of cycling wasn't just learning how to get better at riding the bike, it was also getting better at understanding the bike and ultimately making it your own. And that was as much a part of the ride as anything else. And, you know, When I think back on earlier days of riding, it's hard to say what I remember more fondly. The discovery of figuring out how something works and how to put it together in my garage while listening to classic rock on a Saturday night, or the moment when riding that bike with the improvements I made, I was able to, let's say, get over an obstacle I couldn't get over before, or get to the top of a hill faster than I remember, whatever. Again, it's all about the ride, but part of that ride, part of that experience was not just riding the bike, but again, setting it up so that it was yours. And, that also gave you in the process more hands-on experience, a little bit of learning about mechanical stuff, and, appreciation for how things fit together and what they did. And I honestly think it made you a better rider, and it, more importantly, allowed you to have more fun. So, just one of the reasons why I really like these old bikes, and I'm really looking forward to putting this together. And hopefully there'll be a what do you call it? Review of the damn thing coming up when I get it all in shape. So, Lone Rider out. Rock on. Stay cool. Ride safe.